the narrow bend of Draycott Lane, where the gas lamps hummed like sleepy bees and the fog curled in long, lazy tendrils, there lived an old clockmaker named Ambrose Peat. He was a man of gentle routines and quieter thoughts, his fingers always ink-stained or dusted with brass shavings. Ambrose had not left London in 42 years. He liked the damp. He liked the groan of the floorboards in his shop, the faint smell of oil and beeswax. Above all, he liked the clocks, dozens of them, hanging and ticking, each with a sound, as distinct as a whisper from an old friend. His shop, wedged between a hatmaker and an apothecary, had windows clouded with condensation and shelves laden with time. Wooden cuckoos, somber grandfather clocks, delicate porcelain-faced timepieces from Vienna and Prague, all stood watch in dusty formation. Each was a quiet companion, loyal and regular, save for those occasional nights when they weren't. People, in the neighborhood, believed the clocks ran on something other than time, on memory perhaps, or melancholy. Children dared each other to press their ears to the shop window, swearing they heard things. Laughter, violin music, once even a soft meow, though Ambrose had never owned a cat. One child claimed he'd seen a clock tick backwards when Ambrose, passed by Ambrose for his part, paid little mind to these rumors. He was not an unkind man, but he was a quiet one, and quiet people often become mystery without meaning to. He opened the shop each morning at the same minute, 8:08, and closed it exactly as the first shadow fell across the doorframe. He sold few clocks. He was not in the business of sales, not really. He was in the business of remembering at exactly 10:07 each night. Ambrose would wind the grand orrery in the center of the room, an ancient brass thing shaped like the solar system, and he would hum something half forgotten. He never forgot to do this, not once. The orrery sat beneath the domed skylight of the workshop, and on cloudless nights, the moon would pool silver across its surface. He would trace its delicate rings with a feather duster, as if brushing the stars themselves. Then, after a quiet nod to the moon through the round attic window, he would sit by the fire with a tin of anchovy biscuits and read from an atlas with no names. The book was old, bound in green leather with a broken spine, its pages filled with maps of places that didn't quite exist. Islands shaped like sleeping birds, continents with winding rivers that looped back into themselves. That's when the ticking would change just subtly. A few clocks would skip, others would slow as if listening. A chime would sing when none were due, and Ambrose, with the light catching his spectacles just so, would murmur, "Not yet, but soon." Outside, the fog would press its face against the window panes, curious. The street, usually quiet by 10, would feel even quieter then, like the world was waiting for something. Ambrose often wondered if time itself ever got tired, if after years of relentless forward motion, it might pause one evening, just long enough for someone to step aside, to look around. That was what his clocks were, in a way, pauses, moments preserved like insects in amber. He had once repaired a watch that ticked only when held by someone in love, another that refused to strike midnight unless spoken to in French. He never asked where they came from. That evening, as the wind picked up and the fog thickened into soup, Ambrose was polishing the tiny brass hands of a delicate travel clock. It had been sent to him anonymously, wrapped in layers of oilskin and scented faintly with lavender. The mechanism was unfamiliar, foreign. He suspected Turkish work, though the inscription inside was in a language he couldn't place. The ticking was irregular, stubborn almost, as if the clock didn't want to be fixed. He worked slowly, gently, whispering to it as he went, not in words, but in tone. He believed clocks, like cats, responded best to calm voices. When the hands finally moved of their own accord, he smiled, soft and satisfied. Upstairs, in his modest apartment above the shop, the kettle began to hiss. He rose, joints creaking like old hinges, and went to make his evening tea, Lady Grey, with a touch of clove. He poured it into a mug shaped like a badger and carried it back down, careful not to spill a drop. He settled into his armchair just as the clocks began their subtle chorus. The orrery turned with a faint grind, and from somewhere in the back of the shop came the delicate ping of something unlocking. Ambrose did not move. He sipped his tea, listened. Then, from the farthest wall, a shelf rarely touched, a small clock let out a single, uncertain chime. It was one he hadn't wound in decades, one he thought broken. It was shaped like a seashell, and inside its face were tiny stars, so faint they barely flickered even in candlelight. Ambrose set down his mug. He walked to the clock, placed his palm on its glass face and waited. The chime came again, softer this time. He nodded. "Soon then," he said, and with that, the clocks resumed their usual rhythms. The orrery slowed, and the night folded around Draycott Lane like a page in an old quiet book. The next morning brought rain, a soft, insistent drizzle that slicked the cobbles and dappled the windows with tiny whirls of refracted light. Ambrose Peat rose, as he always did, at precisely 6 minutes past 6, and by the time the first bell of St. Thalassa's chimed, he was already dressed, his tea steeping, and his boots polished with care that belied their age. He did not expect visitors. He rarely did. But that morning, as he descended the stairs with a biscuit between his teeth and the scent of bergamot clinging to his cuffs, he noticed something odd. The front doormat, always placed at a particular slant, had been moved, only slightly, barely, noticeable. But to a man who measured time by the heartbeat of gears, it was enough. He opened the door. No one. Just the hush of rain and the smell of wet brick. Yet, as he stepped outside to adjust the mat, he spotted something curious on the sill, a small card, cream-colored, tucked into the crook of the wood. There was no writing, only a pressed violet, delicate and slightly crushed. Ambrose turned it over, frowning gently. "An old flower for an old friend," he muttered. He brought it inside and placed it beneath the corner of a clock's glass case, a habit he'd adopted long ago for items of uncertain purpose. If it were meant to be understood, he reasoned, it would reveal itself in time. By 8 past 8, the shop was open. Clocks hummed, the kettle boiled again. A soft waltz played from a gramophone hidden behind a drapery. The day drifted by in gentle increments. 2 customers came, Mrs. Penby, to have her husband's pocket watch restrung, and a wiry lad with copper-colored hair who wanted something that sounded like a memory. Ambrose gave him a metronome with a faded inscription. He paid in buttons. It was near dusk when she arrived. The bell above the door rang out in 2 distinct tones, an oddity in itself. And there stood a woman, soaked at the hem, her boots caked in the pale dust of country roads. She wore a velvet cloak of deep forest green, the hood drawn back to reveal silver-streaked curls and eyes the color of stormglass. She looked around the shop, taking in every ticking face, every slow-moving pendulum. "You still keep them all," she said, voice soft and unhurried. Ambrose did not answer at once. He was looking at her with the wary familiarity one reserves for dreams half-remembered. "You're late," he said finally, as if those were the only words time had left him. "I came as soon as the seas allowed." "Then the seas are slower than they once were," she smiled, sad and brief. "Everything is." Ambrose motioned toward the hearth. "You'd best warm yourself." "Tea?" She nodded. "If you still have that clove blend." They said nothing, more for several minutes. Only the clink of china and the steady lull of the clocks filled the room. When she finally spoke, it was to say, "It's begun again, hasn't it?" Ambrose didn't answer. He reached behind the counter and retrieved the seashell clock, the one that had chimed the night before. He held it out to her. It rang twice. She took it with a reverent slowness, fingers tracing its edge. "And you remember what that means?" "I remember enough." The woman looked toward the orrery, now still and bathed in the faint orange blush of evening. "They're waking," she said. "The ones who remember the first ticking." Ambrose sighed. "And forgetting all, the same as we do." Outside, the rain ceased. The last droplets clung to the eaves like notes waiting for their music. The woman reached into her cloak and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. "There's a name missing," From the list. Ambrose took it, squinted, and nodded slowly. She's not lost, just not yet returned. They rarely return the same, no one does. For a long while neither spoke. Then the woman rose, dusted rain from her sleeves, and looked at him with a softness that trembled on the edge of sorrow. You'll come when it's time? Ambrose looked around his shop, his little temple of hours, and for a moment years fell from his face. I'll come when the clocks forget to tick. She bowed her head and left as quietly as she'd come. Only after the bell above the door settled did Ambrose return to the seashell clock. It no longer chimed, but inside its face the tiny stars shimmered, faintly pulsing. And somewhere just beyond the curve of the visible world, something remembered him. The morning after the velvet-cloaked visitor departed, Ambrose Peat awoke from a dream that left no images behind. Only the lingering sensation of tide and salt, and something distant calling his name. The clocks were unusually quiet. Not silent, never silent, but hushed as though they too had dreamt. A few pendulums swung with exaggerated care, ticking not with rhythm but with caution, like footsteps in a cathedral. Ambrose, dressed in his usual manner, brushing a speck of dust from his waistcoat and polishing his spectacles until the fog of sleep lifted from the glass. But as he descended the stairs, a new sound met him, not mechanical, not wood or brass. It was the soft, unmistakable gurgle of water. He paused. It was coming from the back of the shop. Ambrose moved slowly past the shelves, past the cuckoos and sundials, until he reached the farthest corner, where a battered tin sign once advertising horological repair and gentle recollection had long since faded to ghostly lettering. There, resting on a low table that hadn't held anything in years, was a clock he didn't remember placing. It was round, set in a shell of bleached coral, its face a swirl of blues and greens like the ocean seen through sea glass. And from it came the sound not of ticking, but of waves. Soft, patient waves. Ambrose stared. Then, gently, reverently, he picked it up. The hands didn't move. They pointed instead, due west, and slightly downward. Not a time, but a direction. He held it close to his ear, heard gulls, faint bells, laughter, and weeping. Ah, he whispered, more to himself than the clock. So it's one of those. He had only encountered 3 in his lifetime, clocks that held memories not of the owner, but of the maker. And this one had been made in sorrow. He carried it to the work table, cleared a space among the usual debris, gears, velvet pouches, feather brushes, and placed the coral clock at the center. He did not open it, not yet. Clocks like this were not meant to be forced. They opened themselves when ready. Instead, he began the ritual of quiet work, oiling the mainsprings of another, less haunted timepiece, whistling tunelessly, letting his presence calm the room. Hours passed. Rain returned. A tabby cat, whom Ambrose had never fed but who nonetheless visited daily, curled on the rug near the fire. Then, without fanfare, the coral clock clicked. Its face turned dark, then clear, then showed a single image, a ship, a tall one, masted, and strange, with sails like wings and a hull of dark green wood. It moved not across water but through fog, floating above the sea's surface by the width of a whisper. Ambrose did not blink. He simply said, "So you found her." The image shifted. The deck of the ship. A woman. No, a girl. Barefoot. Hair wild with salt and wind, staring out at something the image didn't show. She was smiling, but her eyes were red. The clock clicked again, and the image disappeared. Ambrose folded his hands. He knew what this meant. Not a warning, a reminder, a piece of the past returning, a promise once made, floating just beneath the waves of the present. He rose, went to the shelf where he kept a dusty box marked Forsworn Repairs. and drew from it a thin journal bound in whale leather. On the first page was a single name written in violet ink, Era. He traced the name with one finger, then looked to the coral clock again. It was ticking now, not like a clock, like a heartbeat. And Ambrose, old and quiet as he was, felt something stir in his chest that hadn't moved in decades. Not fear, not sadness, hope, faint and foolish, but real. The sky had turned to pewter by the time Ambrose lit the evening lamps. Outside, the fog returned with a familiar weight, settling over Draycott Lane like an old blanket that had forgotten the shape of the bed it once covered. The shop, always dim by design, now glowed like a lantern caught in a bottle, warm, small, and adrift in a sea of hush. Ambrose sat at his desk, the coral clock beside him, ticking faintly with its oceanic breath. The journal lay open, the name Era untouched. Since morning. He had not written in the book in over 30 years. Not since she disappeared. Not since she boarded the ship of forgetting. He took up a nib pen, dipped it in ink the color of midnight tea, and added a second line beneath her name. She dreams of anchors and wakes in storms. It was not a sentence. It was a remembering. Ambrose didn't write in prose when it came to her. Only fragments, clues, threads he hoped would one day spool themselves back into a whole. He closed the journal and returned it to its box. Not because he was finished, but because that was enough for now. Instead, he turned to another relic, the atlas. The green-leathered book had lived on his hearthside table longer than most of the clocks had lived in his shop. It was an impossible book, both real and not, its maps shifting slightly when one looked away. Ambrose had learned to read it the way one reads a half-told story, not for fact, but for pattern. Tonight, he opened it to a page he had not dared in many years. No title. Just a coastline shaped like a sleeping hound, and an archipelago like spilled tea leaves. Tiny villages with names that changed depending on the weather. And there at the bottom, barely legible, Thyra's Wake. He tapped it gently. "You've moved," he said aloud. The cat, still curled on the rug, twitched one ear. Ambrose reached for a candle and held it close to the page. In the flickering light, the waters around Thyra's Wake shimmered and revealed a faint inked path, a dotted line leading east, then south, spiraling into a whirlpool symbol. Beside it, a note had been added. Not by him. Follow only when the clocks weep. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. Someone, something, had updated the atlas. That had happened only once before. He remembered it well. It had been the day Era left. Ambrose stood, stretched the stiffness from his joints, and crossed to the coral clock. The seashell casing felt warm, almost pulsing. "You're her anchor now, aren't you?" he murmured. She gave up the old one. The clock responded with a single click. Affirmation. He turned it over. Inscribed into the coral, so faint it took tilting the light to see, were the words, "To the boy who stitched time, I remembered." Ambrose closed his eyes. For a moment, he was not in his workshop, not on Draycott Lane. He was standing at a cliff's edge, gulls above, sea below, wind behind, and she was beside him, laughing. "I'll be back before the tide forgets me," she had said. It had taken the tide 40 years. He returned the clock to the desk, then went to the back of the shop, where an old steamer trunk sat beneath a dusty cover. He hadn't opened it in decades. The key was still in his pocket, on a chain of pressed copper links she had given him. He unlocked the trunk. Inside, rope, charts, a pair of worn gloves, and a compass whose needles spun only when one lied. And beneath it all, wrapped in velvet, a map, hand-drawn, unfinished. Ambrose spread it on the work table. It showed a coastline similar to the atlas, Thyra's Wake, but no path, no cities, no names, just ink and silence. He placed the coral clock at the center, then waited. The ink began to move, not fast, not like magic in a storybook, slowly, as if time were remembering its own footsteps. The path reappeared. and beside it a new marking, a cross, a point of arrival. Ambrose whispered, "She's coming home." But he knew better. Clocks didn't chime for arrivals, only departures. The following morning arrived without sunrise. The sky hung low and sullen, a ceiling of bruised clouds that pressed upon the rooftops of Draycott Lane like the heavy lid of an unspoken secret. The clocks in Ambrose's shop ticked on, but their sounds were subdued as if they too sensed the dimness in the world outside. Ambrose stood by the window, a cup of clove-laced tea in hand, watching the street through a veil of mist. Even the milkman's cart moved slower today, its wheels whispering against wet cobbles, its horse steaming in the cold. He had slept only a little, and not well. Too many clocks had stirred in the night. Not ticking. No, that would have been expected. But whispering, tiny, almost inaudible clicks and murmurs, conversations between gears, a rhythm not meant for ears but for memory, and in his dream, someone had slipped a letter into his coat. He had awoken with that strange certainty only dreams provide, and when he checked the inner pocket of his coat, yes, it was there, a letter, folded, sealed with blue wax bearing an emblem he knew too well, a compass rose surrounded by 12 stars, the symbol of the original timekeepers. He hadn't seen it in decades. He didn't open it right away. He placed it on the table beside the coral clock, its presence pressing into the room like a third breath. Then slowly he sat down, unfolded a linen cloth and unwrapped a slice of treacle tart. Only after the first bite did he break the seal. The letter inside was short. "Ambrose, you are not the last." She has remembered the forgotten path, but it does not lead only to her. There is another, one we thought unraveled, lost in the turning. Meet him at the bell foundry. He won't know you, not at first. Bring the watch that hums in moonlight, and hurry. Some clocks have begun to lie. L. Ambrose. Read it twice, then a third time. "L," he whispered. "Of course it would be you." He folded the letter with care and tucked it into the atlas. Then he rose, crossed the room, and opened a drawer labeled "Uncertain Repairs." Inside, resting in a nest of black velvet, was a pocket watch with no face. Instead of hands, it held a tiny globe of opaline glass, suspended in a ring of silver filigree. When held beneath the light of the moon, the globe glowed softly and sang, a single tone, low and round and endless, like a breath drawn in but never released. He slipped the chain over his wrist and watched the globe for a moment. It shimmered, but did not yet sing. Still, it was humming faintly. That was enough. Next, he checked the coral clock. It had gone silent again, but the direction of its hands had shifted, now pointing eastward, toward the river, toward the bell foundry. It had not rung in years, that old place. Once it had crafted the most resonant bells in all of England. Bells that told not just hours, but moods, seasons, omens. Then the river shifted, the trade faded, and the bell makers disappeared. Only dust and silence remained, or so it was. Believed. Ambrose wrapped the coral clock in oilskin, tucked the watch into his coat and locked the shop door behind him. He left a single sign in the window, written in his familiar, looping hand. Back before the tide. Draycott Lane faded behind him like a dream upon waking, familiar, beloved, but growing distant with every step. Ambrose Peat moved through the fog-cloaked streets of London with the steady grace of someone who had walked them 1,000 times, and once perhaps in another life. He carried no umbrella. The drizzle laced his coat in a fine sheen of silver. He didn't seem to mind. The bell foundry stood in the east quarter, along the curve of the old river where the water darkened, and the cobblestones grew uneven. Few came here anymore. Fewer still remembered the songs the bells once sang, the soft lament of the Tuesday bell, the jubilant thrum of the solstice peal, or the bell that tolled only at midnight when the wind blew from the north. It was a place of echoes now. The building itself leaned slightly, as though bowing to its own forgotten purpose. Ivy curled up its walls like ancient script. Windows were dark and dust-blind. A rusted sign dangled overhead. Thalwick and Sons, bell-rights of note and necessity. Ambrose stepped through the iron gate with a respectful nod, as though addressing an old acquaintance who'd grown hard of hearing. The courtyard within was silent but not empty. Pigeons scattered as he passed, and somewhere hidden in the shadows, a cat watched him with the disinterested gaze of an unpaid guardian. He approached the main doors, broad oak bound in tarnished brass, and laid a hand upon their weathered surface. They opened, not from within nor from any visible force, but slowly, creaking, as if time itself had remembered its manners. The inside smelled of rust, soot and something sweeter. Beeswax, perhaps, or old lavender. Bells hung everywhere in rows from rafters set on shelves, cradled in nests of straw. Some were no bigger than a thimble, others could have swallowed a man whole. All were quiet, watching. Ambrose walked slowly down the central aisle, his boots stirring soft clouds of dust. He paused before each bell, as if greeting them. Some he touched lightly, others he simply regarded with a soft nod. Then he reached the back. There, beside a broken furnace and beneath a skylight smeared with time, stood a boy, or rather a young man, no older than 20 perhaps. His coat was threadbare, his boots cracked with wear. He held a hammer in one hand and a bell mold in the other, though his eyes were fixed on the floor, unfocused. He didn't notice Ambrose at first. Ambrose waited. After a moment, the young man looked up, and for a heartbeat the world held its breath. "You're early," he said, blinking. His voice was scratchy, uncertain. "Or late?" Ambrose smiled faintly. "That depends on which bell you're listening to." The boy frowned, then glanced down at the mold in his hand. "It sang to me last night, not with sound, with shape. It wanted to be this." He turned it slightly. The mold was elegant, odd. 12-petaled ridges, no clapper groove, and etched around its base were faint symbols, similar to those on the atlas in Ambrose's shop. Ambrose stepped closer. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The boy hesitated. "I don't know," he said. "Not really, they call me Echo." Said I answered too many questions with silence. Ambrose looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded. "Echo will do." From his coat, Ambrose drew the watch, the one with the humming globe, and held it out. The young man stared. "That's the sound I dreamed," he said quietly. "But I thought it came from the river." He reached out and took the watch. It pulsed in his palm, and in that moment, every bell in the foundry rang, not loudly, but once, together. A single note, like the breath between memory and speech. "Echo," gasped. Ambrose placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You were a timekeeper once, you forgot, as we all did. But your bell remembered you." The young man looked down at the mold. "What is it for?" "A reckoning," Ambrose said. "A return." Outside, the fog deepened, and the clocks, wherever they were, held their breath again. The bell foundry did not sleep that night. While the rest of London folded itself into lamplight and coal fires, the East Quarter hummed faintly with a memory long buried. It was not sound, not quite. A reverberation felt more than heard, like the echo of a name once whispered through cathedral stone and never quite silenced. Ambrose remained in the shadows of the foundry, quietly watching as the boy called Echo moved between work tables and cooling racks with instinctual grace. He did not speak much, but neither did Ambrose press him. Time was not made by pushing. It was revealed by waiting. The bell mold, now resting in the center of the room, had begun to hum, not aloud, but within its form, inside the ridges and hollows of its cast, something ancient stirred. Ambrose laid out a circle of instruments. Around it, a tuning fork carved from antler bone, a scale that measured weight in memories instead of grams, and a vial of river water drawn from the bend beneath Thyra's wake. From his coat, he removed the coral clock. He placed it beside the mold. Echo looked at it, his brow furrowing. It's ticking in reverse. Ambrose only nodded. Good, that means we're near the right point. Echo hesitated. What point? Ambrose knelt, drawing a small line in the dust with the tip of his cane. Time, he said gently, is not a road, it's not even a river, it's a bell. Echo stared. Ambrose continued. A bell rings out. The sound spreads. Layers upon layers of vibration, intersecting, returning. And in some rare places, some rare moments, the bell rings again from the other side. The young man's eyes widened slightly. So, this is one of those places? Ambrose smiled, faintly. It is tonight. Outside, the fog began to swirl, not with wind, but as if something beneath it stirred. The smell of brine crept through the cracks in the stone walls, and somewhere far off a gull cried, though the river hosted no such birds. Echo took the opaline watch from his coat. It was glowing now, soft and steady. He held it near the bell. Mold. The humming grew stronger. Then, without warning, the mold cracked, a clean fracture right down the center. Ambrose did not flinch. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Echo's shoulder. It's ready. Echo blinked. But it's broken. No. It's becoming. Ambrose took up the vial of river water and poured a thin line around the mold. Steam rose, carrying the scent of wet stone and forgotten places. The glow from the watch intensified, and slowly, like a flower unbending in moonlight, the mold split open. Inside it sat a bell of polished green metal, streaked faintly with gold. It had no clapper, no inscription, but it vibrated with a low, mournful frequency that made the very air feel older. Echo stepped back. Ambrose bowed his head. She remembered, he whispered. The coral clock ticked once. The bell rang, not loudly, but with infinite depth. It rang, not only in the foundry, but across the clocks in Ambrose's shop, across the maps of the Atlas, across the dreams of those who once forgot something precious. It rang in the sea, and from somewhere beneath the tide, a voice answered. The sound of the bell hung in the air long after its vibration faded. It did not echo in the usual sense. Rather, it lingered, as though it had struck not only the space within the bell foundry, but also the spaces between thoughts, between moments. The silence that followed was rich, almost golden, like the hush in a great library when someone turns the last page of a beloved book. Ambrose remained still. His eyes were closed. His hand rested gently on the coral clock. Echo stood beside the newly born bell, eyes wide, the watch in his hand still glowing. It pulsed with a rhythm not unlike a heartbeat or the sway of tide against forgotten shores. Then faintly came a sound, not from the bell, not from the foundry, from the air itself. It was the creaking of wood, the groan of rope drawn taut and far. Off, impossibly far, the calling of a ship's bell, not brass but bone. Not rung by hand but by memory. Ambrose opened his eyes. She's near. Echo turned toward him. Who? But even as he asked, he knew. The images came not in flashes, but in feelings. Salt wind, laughter caught in rain, a coat stitched with stars. A woman walking barefoot on a deck that never docked. Error, Ambrose said softly. She's returning. Or she's remembering how. The bell before them shimmered once, then dimmed. It had done its work. Ambrose reached into his coat and drew out a key. It was old, made of iron, shaped like a question mark and warm to the touch. He handed it to Echo. She'll look for this. Echo hesitated. What does it open? Not a door, Ambrose said, a direction. The fog outside deepened. A new wind stirred. The cat from earlier had wandered into the foundry and now perched atop a crate, its green eyes wide, unblinking. Ambrose walked to the far side of the room, where an old hatch led down to the docks, long, sealed, unused. He unlocked it. The key clicked once, then dissolved into mist. Below, where the river should have been, there was no water, only sky. Endless twilight sky. And floating toward them, quiet and regal, was a ship. Its sails were translucent. Its hull was etched with names written in languages that no longer had alphabets. Lanterns swung from the railings, each glowing with a different phase of the moon. It was the ship from the Coral Clock, the one from Ambrose's dream, and from its bow someone stepped forward. Not onto land, not into the foundry, but into remembering. She wore boots of woven kelp and a cloak of grey feathers. Her hair was silver with strands of night. She carried nothing, no bag, no blade, no clock, but she held herself like a person who remembered all the things she once gave away. Ambrose met her gaze. "Era," he said, voice breaking just slightly. She smiled. "Ambrose, you still keep time like a prayer." He nodded. "And you still carry storms in your wake." She laughed, soft as wind over sleeping waves. "I didn't think I'd remember the way back." "You didn't. The tide did." They stood in silence for a moment, not needing more. Then Era turned to Echo. Her eyes widened just a little. "You..." Echo shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know who I am." Era stepped forward, laid a hand gently on his shoulder. "Not yet," she said, "but you're beginning." The coral clock ticked once, and the bell, just faintly, trembled in reply. The air beneath the bell foundry had changed. It no longer smelled of soot and rust, but of salt, lavender, and old wood long seasoned by sea wind. The space under the hatch, once a dusty cellar filled with discarded molds and forgotten tools, had shifted, unfolded perhaps, into something older than the building itself. Ambrose stepped down first, cane in hand, boots quiet on the stone. Era followed, her stride easy, as though the space remembered her feet. Echo brought up the rear, his expression a blend of awe and uncertainty, the glowing watch held tightly in his hand. The chamber was vast. Arches of bone and driftwood held up a ceiling, threaded with lanterns that burned without flame. The walls, where once there had been brick, now shimmered like the inside of a pearl, iridescent, alive. At the far end, the harbour waited. Not a harbour in the usual sense. There was no sea, no water, and yet ships rocked gently at their moorings. They floated on something softer than air, anchored by ropes tied to memory and mist. There were 3 of them. The first was long and sleek, with sails that looked like pages from a diary. The second was round and squat, made of stone and moss, chimneys puffing faint letters into the gloom. The third was the one Era had arrived in. It pulsed with quiet light, its deck humming with unread stories. Ambrose paused beside it, laying a hand on the rail. "You found it," he said quietly. "The tide that forgets to flow." Era smiled. "I had help. Some memories don't want to stay buried." Echo stood beside a coiled rope, watching the ships sway on their invisible current. "What is this place?" Era answered gently. "A harbour between ours, a place clocks don't count," Ambrose added. "It was once called the last anchorage, but we named it too soon. Some things still arrive." Echo looked down at the glowing watch in his hand. "It started humming louder when we came down here." "That's because it's near its twin," Era said. She walked to a small alcove near the harbour's edge and knelt. There, resting on a cushion of velvet and lichen, was another watch, identical in shape to Echo's, but dull, silent, and cracked down the center. She picked it up and held it beside Echo's. The cracked watch glowed faintly. "They were made for a pair of brothers," she said. "One stayed behind to keep the hours, the other sailed to forget them." Echo looked confused. "Brothers?" Ambrose placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "One of them was named for the silence after music," Era finished, "and the other for the moment before." Echo looked from one to the other. "That's why I'm called Echo." "Partly," Ambrose said, "but also because you answer things no one else hears." A soft chime filled the chamber. It did not come from a bell nor from a clock, but from the harbour itself. A deep resonant note, like the opening of a long-forgotten journal. Era turned toward the sound. "It's time." "For what?" Echo asked. Ambrose stepped forward, looking suddenly older, softer, to decide. Era extended her hand toward Echo. "There are 3 ships," she said. "One leads forward, one leads back, and one stays exactly where it is." Echo looked at her, then at Ambrose, then down at the 2 watches in his hands. The cracked one had begun to glow again, steady and soft. "I don't know where I belong." "That's not the question," Era said. Ambrose nodded. "The question is, where are you needed?" Outside, beyond the harbor, beyond even the bell foundry, clocks across the city paused. Not stopped, but softened, as though leaning in, waiting for an answer. Echo took a breath and stepped toward the 3rd ship. Echo placed one foot on the gangplank of the 3rd ship, and the vessel responded not with sound, but with stillness, an attentive, watchful kind of stillness, like an elder leaning forward to hear a child's first word. The ship, now clearer in the light of the harbor, seemed woven rather than built. Its hull was a patchwork of different woods, stitched with brass seams and runes too faint to read. No sails adorned its masts, only wind chimes of glass and thread, which swayed gently despite the absence of breeze. Echo turned to look at Ambrose and Era. His expression was not of fear, but of gravity, like someone realizing they had become the page instead of the reader. "She knows me," he said softly. "Of course she does," Era replied. "She waited for you." Ambrose walked to the edge of the quay, his hand resting on the coral clock. It was ticking steadily now, no longer strange or backwards, simply present. "That ship," he said, "has a name, but it's only spoken once." Echo looked puzzled. "When?" Ambrose smiled gently. "When it leaves." Echo stepped fully aboard. The deck greeted him with a soft creak. Acknowledgement, not protest. Lanterns flickered to life along the rails, glowing with a pale gold light that warmed the mist rather than pierced it. The opaline watch on his wrist pulsed once. Era joined Ambrose at the water's edge, arms folded, watching the boy explore the ship. She didn't speak for a long time. When she did, it was more thought than voice. He doesn't remember being a timekeeper. "No," Ambrose said, "but the ship does." Era turned her face to him. "And you?" He looked down at the coral clock. "I remember everything." "That's my curse." She touched his arm, soft and brief. "Not all remembering is sorrow, but enough is." On the ship, Echo had found the helm, not a wheel, but a kind of compass made of mirrors and threads. It responded to touch, not with movement, but with images. Brief, flickering visions of places unmoored by time, a staircase in a house that no longer stood, a meadow filled with chairs, a tower built inside a whale. Echo blinked and drew his hand back. The compass quieted. The ship was waiting. He turned again to Era and Ambrose. "What do I do now?" he asked. "You listen," Ambrose said. Era added, "You steer by silence." The ship let out a single note, not a horn, not a bell, but something between breath and memory. The chimes above the mast danced, their tones soft and round as if singing a lullaby to the fog. Then the ship began to move. Not forward, but inward. It didn't sail away from the harbor. It sank gently into the mist, like a dream returning to the soul that dreamt it. Echo stood at the helm, his eyes wide but calm. The glowing watch wrapped tight around his wrist, and just before the ship disappeared, he whispered a single word. Ambrose caught it. He did not say it aloud, but the coral clock ticked in reply. Era placed her hand over her heart. The ship was gone, and in its place, only mist and stillness. But something had changed. Far above, back. In Draycott Lane, the clocks in Ambrose's shop all struck the hour at once. Not in unison, but in harmony, like a choir, each voice distinct yet woven into the others. Ambrose turned toward Era. "Well," he said softly, "now we wait." She nodded. "Or prepare." He raised a brow. "For what?" She looked upward, toward a sky no one could yet see. "For the ones who come after." Ambrose and Era stood in silence, long after the ship vanished into mist. The lanterns in the harbour dimmed one by one, their glow sinking into the floor like spilled candlelight. There was no farewell, no sign, no final sound. Only the hush. That comes when something important has passed. Eventually, Era turned. "We should go." Ambrose didn't move right away. His hand still rested on the coral clock, which now sat quiet and warm in his pocket. It no longer pulsed. It no longer ticked. It had become something else. He nodded slowly. Yes, the shop will be waking. They left the harbour the way they came, up the narrow stair beneath the bell foundry hatch, which now creaked with age it had not shown before. Dust returned to the corners. The smell of rust and soot reclaimed the air. The world, as it often does, pretended nothing strange had happened. Outside, the fog had lifted. Dawn glowed faintly at the edges of the city, not bright, but willing. The streets of the East Quarter lay empty, save for the occasional newspaper fluttering across the cobbles like a lost thought. They walked in companionable silence, the way old friends sometimes do, when all the important things have been said, and what remains is the quiet work of remembering together. When they reached Draycott Lane, the lamps were still on. Ambrose unlocked the shop. The smell greeted him first. Warm wood, brass polish, a trace of clove. The clocks, dozens of them, had begun to tick again. But something in their rhythm had changed. They were slower, not broken, not wrong, but deliberate, as if each clock were now measuring not time, but meaning. Era wandered among the shelves while Ambrose brewed tea. She paused before a cuckoo clock shaped like a crescent moon. When it chirped softly off schedule, she smiled. "You've taught them well," she said. "I only reminded them they could listen." He handed her a cup. "Milk?" "Just a whisper." They sat by the fire, the coral clock placed between them. Era stared at it for a long while. "Do you think he'll find what he needs?" Ambrose sipped. "I think he already did. He just hasn't named it yet." Era nodded. "The ship, did you hear the name?" He gave a small, tired smile. "Yes, but it's not mine to speak." She leaned back in her chair, eyes half-lidded. "The tides shifted," she said. "Something's coming." Ambrose looked around the shop at the clocks and the shadows and the atlas resting on its table. "Do you think it'll find us?" "No," she said softly. "I think we'll find it." And just then, from the very back of the shop, where a cabinet held the oddest and most disobedient pieces, a clock that had not moved in 70 years let out a single, sharp tick. They both looked toward it, then at each other, and neither spoke the name they were thinking. The clock that ticked was a curious one. Ambrose had acquired it in 1873 from a merchant who claimed to have found it buried in the ruins of a monastery near the Austrian border. It was made of a metal no one could name, neither silver nor steel, but something between the two, like moonlight held in solid form. Its face bore no numbers. Instead, it had 12 symbols, each unfamiliar yet faintly unsettling, like forgotten letters from a childhood language once spoken in dreams. For 70 years, it had been silent. Ambrose had wound it, studied it, listened. Nothing. And then, just now, a tick. Not accidental, not mechanical. A choice. He rose from his chair, cane in one hand, teacup in the other, and moved toward the cabinet with the reverence one might show an ancient altar. The clock stood in its usual place, tucked between a sundial that refused to point north and a music box that played only when no one watched. Era followed, quiet and alert. She knew better than to ask. Ambrose set the tea down and opened the cabinet door. The clock stared back. Its hands had moved. They no longer pointed together at the top of the dial, as they had for decades, but now formed a perfect triangle, one aimed toward the 4th symbol, the other toward the 9th. Ambrose squinted. He reached for a magnifying lens and examined the markings. The 4th symbol was a spiral, tight, coiled, reminiscent of a shell or the beginning of a storm. The 9th was an eye half-lidded, watching something just beyond the edge of sleep. Era tilted her head. That's a combination. More than that, Ambrose murmured. It's a direction. He touched the clock's crown gently. It ticked again, and this time something shifted in the room. The light changed. Not dimmer, not brighter, just different. The corners of the shop seemed to stretch subtly, as though trying to hear more clearly. The cuckoo clock whispered a note 2 seconds too early. Ambrose placed the strange clock on the work table. Then he reached for the atlas. When he opened it, the page turned itself, not violently, just firmly. The map was unfamiliar, not the coastlines, Tauvthyra's wake, nor the dreaming islands he had traced in the past. This one showed a city built on bridges and fog, dozens of towers, each shaped like an hourglass. Streets that curved like calligraphy. And in the center, a clock tower taller than any mountain, its hands not pointing to time but pulling it inward like a tide. Era exhaled. It's real then. You've seen it. In fragments, she said. Once, in a mirror lake. Another time in a bowl of ink. I thought it was a metaphor. Ambrose traced the spire with his finger. This city. It remembers the future. The coral clock beside them let out a single chime. A note neither high nor low, but circular. Era blinked. That's a summons. He nodded. It's calling the keeper. The keeper of what? Ambrose didn't answer right away. He picked up the faceless opaline watch Echo had left behind. It was dim now, but warm. He held it beside, the strange metal clock. For a moment they synchronized. Then a soft click, a compartment on the back of the metal clock opened. Inside, a folded slip of parchment, so old the edges had curled inward. Ambrose read it aloud. When the future dreams of us, we must be ready to awaken, Era whispered. It's starting, isn't it? Ambrose's hand trembled slightly as he folded the parchment and placed it in his coat. It always was. The next morning arrived not with sunlight, but with silver. A pale hue filtered through the round windows of the shop, reflecting off brass gears and dust motes like the glint of memory caught in the act of returning. Ambrose Peat stood before the work table, the strange metal clock now wrapped in a cloth embroidered with compass roses. He hadn't slept, or perhaps he had, but only in the way clocks rest between ticks, not truly still, only patient. Era entered from the attic staircase with a kettle in hand. She moved like someone who had sailed through stars and come back with just enough warmth to make tea. He's stirring, she said, nodding toward the atlas. Ambrose looked down. The map of the dreaming city had begun to shift. Not drastically, just small movements like breath under a sleeping child's blanket. The bridges shimmered. A street changed direction. The hourglass towers leaned infinitesimally toward each other, as if whispering secrets. We'll need the path, he said. Era raised a brow. You think it will show itself again? He opened the drawer beneath the atlas. Inside was a wooden tray filled with thin slips of paper, each containing fragments, riddles, sketches, snatches of phrases in languages neither of them spoke fluently. He shuffled through them until he found a piece trimmed with gold leaf. A map, but not a map of place, of when. 12 circles arranged in a spiral, each labeled not with numbers, but with gestures, a blink, a held breath, a forgotten name. At the center, a symbol resembling the face of the strange clock. Era stared. The spiral of entry. Ambrose nodded. The city doesn't exist in ours, it waits between them. He took the parchment and laid it gently across the map in the atlas. At once the two began to align. Streets slid beneath the spiral like metal under magnet. Points of intersection began to glow faintly, pale blue like frost catching lamplight. One began to pulse. A bridge near the center of the city, arched, narrow and nameless. That's our way in, he whispered. Era placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll need more than direction. The gatekeeper won't open the way for just anyone. Ambrose reached into a velvet pouch on the mantel and pulled out 3 objects. A pocket mirror with no reflection. A key with no teeth, and a feather that cast a shadow shaped like a bell. He handed one to Ira. "The mirror. I remember her face," she said, "even if she forgot mine." He took the key, left the feather on the clock. The coral clock ticked once. The shop shifted, just subtly. The door moved half an inch. The light turned cooler, and from the floorboards a soft vibration rose. Not a tremor, but an invitation. Ambrose whispered, "The threshold's near." They gathered their coats, the watch, and the clock wrapped in cloth. At the door, Era turned. "Will it stay, this shop?" Ambrose looked around, at the shelves, the maps, the clocks that had become his only family. "It will wait, just as it always has." He locked the door with the copper key, though he knew it was symbolic. The real lock was deeper. Then they stepped out into Draycott Lane, which looked the same as always, but felt slightly after. The streets beyond Draycott Lane felt softened. As Ambrose and Era walked, the city no longer moved in straight lines. Buildings leaned in quiet conversation. Street lamps blinked just after they passed. Cobblestones, usually sharp beneath. The feet now felt padded, like walking over layers of letters never sent. It was the transition, a subtle folding of the world, the threshold where memory and possibility blur. Neither of them spoke. Some passages are best crossed in silence, like sleep or prayer. They reached the river's edge, not by following a map, but by listening. The air told them where to go, carrying whispers in the patterns of fallen leaves and in the coughs of chimney smoke. Even the pigeons seemed to guide them, swooping only when the path was clear. The water was still, not frozen, just contemplative. Era stopped at the embankment, staring across the surface. "There's no bridge." Ambrose smiled faintly. "There never is." He reached into his coat and withdrew the toothless key. As he held it aloft, it began to warm, glowing gently like iron under moonlight. He turned slowly, pointing it left, then right. At due east it pulsed. "There." Era narrowed her eyes. "Still no bridge." "Not yet." Ambrose held the key forward and whispered 3 syllables in a tongue he only remembered in sleep. The sound did not echo. It folded, and from the water a reflection emerged. Not the bridge, but the memory of it. It shimmered, barely visible, like an idea halfway understood. Spanning the river was an arc of light and shadow, shaped like ribs or reeds bound in song. It had no weight, but it waited. Era stepped forward and placed her foot gently on the first ripple of the reflection. It held. She turned. "Come quickly, dreams don't last." Ambrose followed, careful, reverent. The bridge did not creak or shift, but each step evoked a memory, not his own, but the city's. A child releasing a balloon, a bell rung for no reason, a kiss that never quite landed. Halfway across, the mist grew thick. The river vanished below. The sky turned indigo, and then the air opened, not like a door, like a thought. They stepped through, and the city welcomed them. The first thing Ambrose noticed was the sky. It was not one sky, but many, layered above each other like sheets of silk. Some glowed pink, others grey. One shone faintly with stars. And they moved, slowly, like breathing. No sun, no moon. Only these shifting veils above, as though the heavens themselves were trying to remember what time it was. The city below was built of bridges. Everywhere Ambrose and Era looked, walkways crisscrossed the air, some thin as ribbons, others wide enough for markets. There were no straight roads, no carriages, no carts, just arches and steps, spirals and lifts, all suspended above canals of light. Buildings here had no clear origin. Some looked like houses carved from coral. Others resembled teapots turned into towers. A few hovered slightly, untethered from any street, yet perfectly still, as though held in place by thought alone. And then there were the bells, dozens of them, hundreds, hanging from archways tucked beneath eaves, growing like fruit from the walls. They were not loud. In fact, They did not ring unless someone passed close enough to be known by them. As Ambrose walked beneath a bridge shaped like a harp, one of the bells chimed softly. It was a familiar note. Ira glanced over. "It remembers you," he smiled, without surprise. "I lived here once, in the hours no one counted." A clock tower rose in the near distance, its face constantly shifting between shapes, squares, spirals, orbs, never settling long enough to be read. Beneath it, a plaza stretched wide, paved with mosaics that shimmered like spilled dreams. They stepped into the square. People passed them, but gently. No rush, no noise. Their clothes were strange. Some wore gowns of ticking fabric, others jackets, stitched with hourglasses. And none looked directly at Ambrose or Era, but many paused as if sensing something old returning. Era pointed to a narrow stair curling downward beneath a fountain shaped like a compass. "That's the way." Ambrose took a breath. "To the keeper." Era nodded. They descended. The steps grew darker, not with shadow but with depth. Each one echoed not their steps, but sounds from elsewhere. Thunder from a storm long past. Laughter from a room no longer standing. The sound of pages turning beneath candlelight. At the bottom stood a door. It had no handle, no hinges, just a surface of polished black, reflecting their faces strangely. Slightly older, slightly younger. Ambrose reached out and placed the feather-shaped shadow on it. The door breathed inward, and they stepped into the hall of the keeper. The room was round, lined with curved shelves that held only clocks, no two the same. At the center stood a tall figure in a robe woven from calendar pages. The keeper did not speak. They simply raised their hand and gestured toward a chair. Ambrose sat. The coral clock in his pocket began to pulse again. The keeper looked down at it, then up at Ambrose, and the city outside and above held its breath. The keeper of the city did not speak in the way others did. There was no sound, no movement of lips, no rustle of robe. Yet when Ambrose sat in the chair before them, words bloomed in the air like mist taking shape. "You have carried the echo of a bell too long unrung." Ambrose bowed his head slightly. "I didn't ring it, it found its own voice. That is the nature of memory. It chooses the hour of its return." Era stood just behind, quiet as an old poem. Her gaze moved across the shelves. Each clock was alive, gently vibrating, yet none ticked. Time here, it seemed, was less a current than a hum. The keeper's attention shifted to her. "And you, tide-bearer, still walk in storm shadow. Have you come to weigh what was forgotten?" Era stepped forward. Not to weigh, to witness, and to bring the name. At that, a faint wind stirred in the chamber. From their sleeve, the keeper withdrew a strand of silver thread. It shimmered with moments, flickers of lives both lived and yet to be. They placed it on the table between them. Ambrose stared. In the thread he saw glimpses, Echo standing at the helm of the dream ship, steering into a sky of folded maps. The bells of the city ringing in patterns that formed sentences. A child laughing beneath a clock made of salt. He blinked. "What am I meant to do?" he asked. "You are to remember forward." Ambrose frowned. "I don't understand." The keeper reached for a clock on the shelf, a simple one, square-faced, with hands shaped like feathers. They turned the minute hand counterclockwise until the room shimmered. The walls disappeared. Ambrose found himself on a street of the city, yet empty, faded, quiet in the way things are before they are built. Beneath his feet, dust. Above, the sky trembled, and walking toward him, Echo, but older, changed. The boy's face was lined not with age, but with responsibility. In his eyes was the weight of decisions made while no one watched. He carried a bell in his left hand, and, in his right, a scroll tied with red ribbon. He stopped before Ambrose. "You came," he said. Ambrose reached out, touching the boy's shoulder. "Are you?" Echo nodded. "I am what waits, what learns, what dares to name the hour." He handed Ambrose the scroll. "It's the name of the city, but it must be spoken only once, and only by you." Ambrose took the scroll. The world around them blurred. He was back in the keeper's chamber. The scroll lay unopened in his hand. Era's eyes met his. "It's yours," she whispered. "The remembering must come from you." Ambrose opened the scroll. Inside was one word. It had no letters. It had weight. He spoke it aloud, not with his voice, but with the breath of every hour he had lived, and all the clocks in the keeper's chamber began to tick. When Ambrose spoke the name, the city exhaled, not with wind, not with sound, but with release, as though a breath had been held for generations and was finally allowed to slip free. The shelves around him trembled. The clocks, once ticking, in polite disharmony, now moved together, not in unison but in intention, like stars aligning not by design but by recognition. The keeper lowered their hand. The thread of silver memory dissolved into the floor. Era placed one hand over her chest. "It's begun." Ambrose turned to her, the scroll now gone from his hands. It had returned to wherever such things return, folded back into the breath of time. "What have I done?" he asked. "Not undone," she said. "You've completed the remembering. The city has a name again." Outside, far beyond the chamber, bells rang, not in alarm, not in celebration, but in confirmation. Short notes, long ones, a rhythm like waves. As if the city were testing its voice after centuries of silence, the keeper stepped down from their platform. They reached into their robe and produced a small, round object, smooth, pale grey, like a stone left too long in a river. They handed it to Ambrose. It pulsed once in his palm. "This is the seed of the hour." Ambrose blinked. "What do I do with it?" The keeper did not reply. But Ambrose understood. It was not a tool, not a weapon. It was a beginning, a choice waiting to be made. Era moved beside him. "The ship," she said softly. "He'll need this." Echo's not steering through time anymore. He's steering through meaning. Ambrose nodded. "Then we return." But when he turned to look for the door, it was already open. The path ahead was not stone or stair, but memory, and it was waiting. The path back was not marked. It did not wind or split, did not rise or fall. It unfolded gently as Ambrose and Era walked, paved not with stone, but with scenes from lives they had almost forgotten. A brass doorknob turning beneath a child's hand. Rain falling on an umbrella that never opened. A teacup, cracked but held together by gold. These were not memories they owned. And yet, each one felt offered. The city was showing them its heart. They emerged from the threshold into a place that might have been the same riverbank where they first crossed. But the air had changed. The sky was still layered silk, but now light spilled through, diffused like honey through gauze. Somewhere a bell rang once, high and clear. Draycott Lane waited beyond. Era stood still, taking it in. "It remembers us differently now," Ambrose smiled, "as we remember it." They made their way back to the shop, the streets bending ever so slightly to greet them. When Ambrose unlocked the door, the interior had not changed, and yet it had. The clocks ticked with a new calm, less insistent, more aware. The shadows fell at kinder angles. Even the dust motes danced with more purpose. Era moved to the atlas, laying one hand gently on its cover. "He's close." Ambrose stepped behind the counter, drawing out the cloth-wrapped stone, the seed of the hour. It was still warm in his hand, still pulsing with possibility. He placed it beside the coral clock. For a moment, they pulsed in tandem. Then a sound, soft, like a knock, but not at the door, at the back of the shop. A shelf shifted, a drawer opened itself. And from within, a breeze carried something impossible, the smell of the sea, of salt wind and sails and sky. Ambrose and Era exchanged a look. "He's returned," she said. Ambrose nodded. "Or we've arrived." And from the far end of the shop, where no door had ever been, came a voice they both knew, older now, deeper, but unmistakably echoes. "Time," he said, "needs remembering." The voice came not as sound, but as presence. When Ambrose turned toward the far end of the shop, where no door had ever stood, and yet now there was a passage, he did not walk. He simply arrived, as if the space between had stepped aside for something more important than distance. Echo stood in the threshold. He was changed, no longer the hesitant boy from the bell foundry, nor the quiet apprentice in search of identity. He carried himself with the stillness of someone who had learned to listen not only to clocks, but to the pauses between them. His coat was stitched from threads of twilight. In his right hand, he held a lantern that burned with no flame. In his left, he held nothing, but around that wrist, the opaline watch pulsed in rhythm with the stone on Ambrose's table. Ira stepped forward first. "You found the way," she said. "I didn't," Echo replied. "The way found me." Ambrose's eyes softened. "What did you see?" Echo did not answer with words. Instead, he stepped into the shop and placed the lantern on the floor. Its light spread slowly, not far, not bright, but deep. Every shadow in the room grew more honest. Every object seemed to recall its purpose. "I saw hours that hadn't been born yet," Echo said quietly, "and memories no one had lived. They weren't mine, but they waited for me." He looked at Ambrose. "They still are." Ambrose placed the seed of the hour in Echo's hand. At once, the opaline watch and the coral clock responded, chiming softly, like old friends waking in tandem. Ira whispered, "It's beginning again." "No," Echo said. "It's continuing." He placed the seed inside the lantern. The light changed, not brighter, but wider. And from beneath the floorboards, from behind the shelves, from inside the walls, something stirred. The clocks in the shop began to tick in a new rhythm, a rhythm that echoed a city once unnamed. Echo turned toward them both. "I know. Her name now," he said. "I know why it was forgotten." Ambrose waited. Echo smiled, not with joy, but with understanding, because it was waiting for me to remember it. And somewhere, far, deep, quiet, the great bell of the city rang. Again. The lantern's light did not spread quickly. It moved like morning fog curling into the corners of a forgotten attic. Soft, cautious, respectful of the dust. But where it touched, things changed. The clocks in Ambrose's shop did not tick louder. They breathed, not in a way anyone else might notice. No sudden movement, no glowing hands, but in the way that old friends adjust their posture when someone beloved walks into the room. Echo placed the lantern in the very center of the workshop, just beneath the orrery. It cast no shadows. Instead, it drew them in gently, as if to remind them they too had stories worth telling. Ambrose and Ira stood back, letting the room adjust. The coral clock ticked once. The watch on Echo's wrist hummed in a lower tone than before, deeper, like a cello bow drawn across memory. And then, quite without ceremony, a drawer opened itself. It had not been opened in 39 years. Ambrose raised an eyebrow. "I thought that drawer was empty." Ira chuckled softly. "That's the most dangerous kind." Inside the drawer was a map, but not one drawn by hand. It had formed itself from threads, actual threads, stitched directly into the paper. Some were fraying, others shimmered, and in the very center, a single knot held everything together. Echo reached down and placed one finger on the knot. The room grew still. The orrery above him shifted. Its rings, once slow and graceful, began to move in reverse. Not quickly, just enough to make the dust spiral in small dances. Ambrose whispered, "The world's remembering something." Ira nodded. "Something it forgot on purpose." The knot loosened under Echo's touch, just slightly. The stitched map pulsed with soft light. And then it changed. The threads rearranged themselves, not tearing, not cutting, just shifting, as if they'd been waiting for permission. What emerged was not a new place. It was a time. Ambrose leaned closer. "That's the moment the clocks first stopped," Ira's eyes narrowed. Before the city forgot its name. Echo stood, map still beneath his hand. "I need to go there," he said simply. Ambrose's voice was low. "You can't go to a..." Moment. Echo looked at him with the calm certainty of someone who already had. "Then I'll bring it here." The lantern flared. Once, not fire. Not light. Recognition. Echo stepped back. The watch on his wrist glowed like sunrise behind frosted glass. The coral clock ticked again, and from outside the shop, a wind rose. Not a storm. A change. Ira looked at Ambrose. "He's not going back." "Is he?" Ambrose shook his head. "He's going forward, into what we once left behind." Echo reached toward the lantern. The map folded itself. The clocks in the room stilled, and without another word, he stepped into the light. When Echo stepped into the light, he did not vanish. He thinned, like ink touched by water, like a dream almost remembered. His outline wavered, but his presence deepened, and then the lantern's glow folded in on itself, and he was gone. The shop did not sigh. It did not shift. It listened. Ambrose turned away from the now quiet lantern, his hands clasped behind his back. "He won't bring the moment as it was," he said. "No," Ira replied. "He'll bring it as it should have been." The coral clock sat dormant, hands at rest, its face dim. Ambrose looked down at it. "Do you remember the first silence?" Ira nodded. "I was in the sea then." The clock stopped, and the tides forgot how to return. Ships drifted in place, unsure of the wind. He moved to the orrery. Its rings had stopped their strange reverse. They now hovered, weightless, waiting. Ambrose whispered, "We buried it, that hour. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was unfinished. And now it has a name." Ira placed a hand on the watch Echo had left behind. "It's still humming." The sound was barely audible, a vibration in the bones like the feeling of someone else entering the room just before they speak. She turned to Ambrose. "Do you think he'll find the knot again?" Ambrose answered slowly, "He won't have to. It will find him." Echo stepped into the light and into a world that wasn't. It was not night, not day, not dream, but something more delicate, a pause in the fabric of time, stretched just wide, enough for choice. He stood at the edge of a field. The grass moved like breath. In the distance, bells hung from branches of trees with bark like bronze. Clouds moved sideways, shadows fell upward, and at the center of the field was a clock, not large, not ornate. It was plain, wooden, childlike. Its hands were turning, but backwards. Echo approached slowly. With each step, the world around him flickered, not into darkness, but into alternative, other versions of this hour. Choices not made. Words not spoken. He reached the clock, placed one hand on it. The ticking stopped. And in that stillness, the knot reappeared, no longer stitched, no longer woven, but living. It hovered before him, pulsing. He did not think. He remembered, and with that memory he reached out and untied it. Back in the shop, the coral clock ticked once more. The lantern flared, and from the map drawer, a thread unspooled gently into the air, soft, golden, and new. Ira looked at Ambrose. He whispered, "The hour has returned." The thread drifted like smoke, golden, gentle, without urgency. It looped through the air of Ambrose's shop as if searching for where it belonged. It wound past shelves lined with slumbering clocks, brushed across the cover of the atlas, dipped once over the coral clock, and at last settled into the lantern. There it touched the seed of the hour, and something clicked, softly, not the sound of gears, nor the snap of unlocking. A breath. The lantern pulsed once, twice. Then it opened. Not physically, but completely. From within, Echo stepped out, whole, changed, and quietly luminous. The light followed him only as far as the soles of his boots, as if understanding the rest of the journey was to be walked in shadow. Ambrose and Era didn't speak at first. They watched as Echo looked around the shop with the slow recognition of someone seeing their childhood home after a lifetime away. The shelves, the orrery, even the odd slope in the ceiling beam. Everything had changed. Everything was exactly the same. Echo placed the opaline watch gently beside the coral clock. The two faces glowed faintly, then stilled. No longer ticking, no longer measuring, just being. "I brought it," he said. His voice was different, not deeper but wider. It carried echoes of things unspoken. Ambrose approached. "What did you bring?" Echo met his eyes. "The hour. The one we lost." He turned his palm upward, and there it was, suspended just above his skin, like a bubble made of silence and starlight, the shape of a moment, small, delicate, infinite. It shimmered with possibility. Era stepped close. "It's unfinished," Echo nodded. "It always was, that's why it stopped." Ambrose reached out. His fingers hovered just above it. "Then how do we complete it?" Echo looked to the clocks, not with command, but with compassion. "We don't," he said. "They do." And at once the clocks began to stir, not loudly, not urgently, but with purpose. One by one they ticked, not together, not in rhythm, but in acknowledgement, as if each had been holding its breath, waiting to say, "I remember." The hour hovered in Echo's hand, then lifted. It floated upward, past the coral clock, past the watch, past the ceiling and the orrery, and disappeared into the rafters, where it melted into the beams like dew on morning wood. Ambrose closed his eyes. The room was filled with stillness, but not the kind that waits, the kind that arrives. Outside, Draycott Lane shifted, not in shape, but in spirit. The fog lightened. The windows leaned into the warmth, and somewhere far off a bell rang, not because it was told to, but because it remembered why it once had. The world had not changed, but it had accepted something back, a missing breath, a forgotten pause, an hour once broken, now rewoven. That evening the shop did not close. The bell above the door remained silent, though it should have rung at least twice. No customers came, but the chairs by the fire were warm, and the tea refilled itself without being asked. Ambrose sat in his usual place, the coral clock resting in his lap. It was no longer ticking, it didn't need to. Beside him, Era wrote in a small leather-bound journal, not for record, but for rhythm, as if committing the moment to paper would help the world. Hold on to it longer. Echo stood at the front window, hands folded behind his back. He was watching the street, though not for anyone in particular. The world outside had taken on a softness, like the last chapter of a well-worn book. "It's quieter than I expected," he said. Ambrose smiled. "Peace often is." Era looked up. "You remember everything now?" Echo nodded. "Not all at once, but the forgetting doesn't fight me anymore." He turned toward them. "There were things I thought I had to find. Names, answers, reasons." He paused. "But really I just needed to return the hour, the one no one dared finish." Ambrose traced the edge of the coral clock with his thumb. "It was ours to guard," he said, "but never to keep." Era added, "And now that it's whole, it belongs to everyone again." The clocks around them ticked in a soft, asynchronous harmony, no longer trying to keep time, just sharing it. Echo stepped away from the window and walked to the atlas. It lay closed, undisturbed. He opened it. The pages were blank. He turned them, slowly, no coastlines, no cities, no hidden notes or shifting maps, only paper. Era tilted her head. "It's ready for new ink." Ambrose stood. "That's our last task." He went to the shelf marked Instruments for Hours Yet to Be and retrieved a pen, brass-bodied, nibbed with obsidian, a pen used not for writing what is, but what might become. He handed it to Echo. "You'll draw it?" Echo shook his head. "We will." And together they gathered around the atlas. One by one they added fragments, not places, not names, moments, A garden gate left open on purpose, a letter finally mailed, a bell hung in a forest to keep promises. A ship that never needed sails, a city with a name only spoken once. They didn't speak as they worked. The pen moved like wind through leaves. What they recorded wasn't history, it was hope. And when the final page was filled, the pen lifted on its own and vanished into a drawer that hadn't existed until that moment. Ambrose looked around the shop. It's time. Era nodded. To let it go. Echo placed his hand on the atlas, now warm with memory. Not to end, he said, to rest, and all the clocks agreed. The dawn was pale, not tired, not dim, simply new, as though the sky itself had exhaled a long-held breath and now waited to be filled again. Draycott Lane was hushed, the kind of hush that didn't ask for silence, only appreciation in the shop. The clocks no longer ticked, they no longer needed to. Time was not broken, time was not lost. It had simply been returned to itself, like a letter finally posted, like a song remembered just before it faded. Ambrose stood at the center of the room, one hand resting on the coral clock, the other on the atlas. Echo and Era stood beside him. The light from the lantern, still glowing faintly, had settled into a steady rhythm. It pulsed not with urgency, but with peace, the kind of light you find in libraries at midnight, or in dreams you wake from gently. Ambrose turned to them both. You know what must happen, Echo nodded. The hour must sleep. Ira added, as must its keeper. Ambrose didn't protest. He walked to the armchair beside the hearth, the same chair he'd sat in for years, winding clocks, reading nameless maps, whispering to time. He sat slowly, with the grace of someone returning to a place they never truly left. He placed the coral clock on the mantel, the atlas beneath it, and then he closed his eyes, not in exhaustion but in completion. Era stepped forward and laid her palm on his shoulder. You kept the promise? Ambrose smiled faintly. Time remembers kindness? Echo stepped closer. What should I do now? Ambrose's voice was low. Keep listening. The world speaks in echoes. Then his breath slowed, steady. Still, the coral clock glowed softly, and in the space of that silence, gentle, absolute, something shifted. A bell rang, not in the room, not in the city, but in the world. It was not loud, it did not startle. It settled, and from every clock, every shadow, every forgotten hour across time, a quiet understanding bloomed. The keeper has slept, the hour has returned. The world may begin again. Outside, the first true morning in a long time broke across the rooftops. A child in a different part of the city awoke with a name in her mind she'd never heard before. A bell in a village long drowned rang beneath the water. A map maker in a tower dreamt of a city with bridges made of wind and stars. And in a small shop on Draycott Lane, where no clock now ticked, the warmth of memory lingered like the scent of tea on old wood. Waiting, ready, at peace.